This is my true story. For 25 years, I believed I was serving God by serving my son. He was my world, my burden, my proof that love could survive pain. When the accident took his legs, I took his life onto my shoulders. I fed him, bathed him, carried him like a child long after he became a man. I told myself it was purpose, not punishment. Until one day, a doctor slid an MRI film across the table, and my world collapsed. Before I tell you what I saw, tell me where you're watching from and subscribe so more people hear my story. Every morning began the same way. The sound of the alarm at 6, the ache in my back, the quiet rustle of sheets. I'd walk to his room, turn on the light, and see him lying there, still, silent, fragile as glass. My son, my only son. The boy who once ran through the fields with a kite now stared at the ceiling like the sky had vanished. I would lift him slowly, one arm under his shoulders, the other beneath his legs. He was heavier each year, but I never complained. I carried him from the bed to the chair, set him down gently, and waited for him to blink, his way of saying thank you. Then I'd spoon-feed him breakfast, one bite at a time, wiping the corner of his mouth when food slipped out. He never spoke. Not one word in 25 years. Only eyes that followed me, and a stillness that felt sacred. When he first became paralyzed, the doctors said it was permanent. A spinal injury, they said. No surgery could fix it. My wife couldn't handle the grief. She died just 2 years later. After that, it was only him and me. I made him my purpose. My world shrank to 4 rooms and a routine. Morning wash, medicine at 9, therapy stretches at noon, soft music in the evening. I read the Bible aloud while he stared at the window. I told myself he was listening. Maybe, I thought, he was talking to God silently. That thought kept me alive. I sold my truck to buy a medical bed. Sold my tools to pay the electricity bills. My hands, once strong enough to build houses, became hands that lifted spoons and wiped drool. My neighbors admired me. They said, "You're a saint." Nurses came and went, always amazed by my patience. "You never miss a day," one said once. I smiled, but inside I was empty. Patience isn't a gift. It's what grows when you have nothing else left. In the evenings, I'd push his wheelchair to the porch so he could watch the sunset. I'd tell him stories about when he was little, about his mother's laugh, about the time he broke my glasses playing baseball. He'd blink slowly, like he remembered. Sometimes I thought I saw tears in his eyes. I'd wipe them and whisper, "Don't cry, my boy. I'm still here." That became our unspoken ritual. Me talking, him silent, me sacrificing, him surviving. I believed God had given me a purpose, to carry this weight with faith. Every ache in my back, every sleepless night, I took as a test of love. Some nights I'd fall asleep sitting beside his bed, my hand still on his blanket, afraid that if I let go, he'd disappear. I prayed for miracles that never came, yet I thanked God each day for giving me someone to live for. Friends told me to put him in a care facility, but I couldn't. "He's my son," I'd say. "I made him. I'll care for him." They didn't understand. Love doesn't measure time. It just keeps giving until there's nothing left. The house aged with us. The paint peeled. The air smelled of medicine and soap. His room became both a shrine and a cell. I celebrated his birthdays alone, lighting a candle on a small cake, cutting a slice, and pressing it gently to his lips. He never tasted it, but I always believed he felt it. I told myself he could hear every word, that deep inside his still body was a boy waiting for healing. That belief, that fragile hope, was my oxygen. 25 years passed like that. Seasons changed, neighbors died, and children I once watched grow had children of their own. I never left his side. I refused to travel, refused to rest. I told myself I was doing something holy, caring for someone who couldn't care for himself. My son became my religion. My devotion to him replaced prayer, replaced life. And for 25 years, I believed every second of it meant something sacred, Life built itself around his illness, like vines around a forgotten wall. My world became smaller each year, shaped by hospital visits, pharmacy trips, and the quiet ticking of clocks. I stopped counting birthdays, mine or his. All I cared about was keeping him alive. Neighbors would wave when I pushed his wheelchair outside for sunlight, calling out, "You're a good father, sir." Some even brought food during holidays, leaving it on the porch because they didn't want to disturb us. They saw a man of patience, but what they didn't see was how loneliness had become the air I breathed. Every object in the house told our story. The rubber gloves hanging near the sink, the folded towels stacked beside his bed, the old calendar I never updated. Everything froze in time, just like him. Nurses came and went, young, kind, and full of sympathy. They'd help for a few months, then leave, unable to bear the stillness. One nurse once said, "You have the patience of a saint." I wanted to tell her the truth. It wasn't patience, it was fear. Fear of stopping. Fear that if I ever paused, I'd collapse under the weight of everything I'd lost. I sold my truck first, the one I'd driven since my youth. I told myself I didn't need it anymore. Then went my tools, my furniture, even my wedding ring, all to keep the medicine coming. The world outside my walls kept moving. New roads, new shops, new lives. But mine stayed locked in the rhythm of feeding tubes and folded blankets. I didn't resent it. I thought this was love. That love meant endurance, sacrifice, pain. That's what faith had taught me. A father's love should carry what the world cannot. I used to talk to him constantly. I'd tell him about the weather, the neighbors, the price of wheat, all the little things he used to care about before the accident. I told myself that somewhere inside, he could still hear me, that maybe his silence was listening. When I changed his clothes, I talked. When I cleaned his wounds, I talked. When I prayed aloud so that maybe he'd feel less alone. I believed he was trapped, like a bird in a cage made of his own bones. So I became his voice, his hands, his world. But there were moments, small, fleeting, when doubt crept in. Sometimes at night, when the house was too quiet, I'd sit beside him and wonder if he even knew I was there. I'd watch his chest rise and fall, mechanical, steady, detached from the life I remembered in him. I would whisper, "Do you still know me, my boy?" No answer. Just the hum of the oxygen machine. Yet every morning, I'd start again. Wash him, feed him, change the sheets. That was my promise to his mother before she died. I'll never give up on him. And I didn't. When the world outside grew too heavy, I'd open the Bible. There was a passage I'd repeat daily. Love bears all things, believes all things, hopes all things, endures all things. That verse lived in me. It became the reason I woke up, the reason I kept breathing. People said I was strong, but the truth was I was just afraid. Afraid that if I stopped believing, I'd realize how much of my life had already disappeared. Once, a neighbor's son came to visit. He was around my son's age, strong and healthy. He helped me move some boxes. When he left, I looked at my boy and said softly, "That could have been you." My voice broke halfway through the sentence. I remember sitting there, holding his cold hand and whispering, "God must have his reasons." I didn't know then that the reason wasn't God's at all. It was something far darker, something that would one day turn every sacrifice I made into a cruel joke. But for now, I was still blind, still faithful, still proud of my endurance. I had built my whole identity on the image of a father who never gave up, and I clung to that image like a raft in a storm, not knowing that soon, one scan, one flicker of truth would sink it forever. It began so quietly that I almost didn't notice. Little things, things easy to explain away. I'd walk into his room and feel like the air had shifted, as if something had moved when it shouldn't have. Once I found his glass of water closer to the bed than where I'd left it. I told myself maybe I'd forgotten, maybe my hands were just tired. Then there were his eyes. I'd come in late at night, thinking he was asleep, and catch them open, wide and alert, staring at the ceiling. But the moment he saw me, they'd close. Slow, deliberate. I'd whisper, "You're dreaming, my boy," and tuck the blanket again. But deep inside, something small and cold began to whisper back, "What if he isn't?" Another time, I could have sworn I saw his fingers twitch. It was barely a movement, the kind you'd miss if you blinked. I froze, staring, waiting for it to happen again. It didn't. Hours passed, and doubt turned into guilt. I scolded myself for hoping. Hope, I told myself, was dangerous. Hope had broken me before. The doctors had said his paralysis was complete, that his nerves were dead, his muscles useless. They had shown me scans, explained in long words I didn't understand. So who was I to question them? Who was I to believe my eyes over their science? But the signs didn't stop. One afternoon, while I was cleaning his face with a wet cloth, I saw the faintest twitch at the corner of his mouth, like the beginning of a smile. I froze, staring at him. "Can you feel this?" I asked, my voice trembling. No answer. His eyes stayed blank. I tried again. "If you can hear me, blink twice." Nothing. Just silence. I leaned back, ashamed of my own foolishness. Maybe I was imagining it. Maybe years of exhaustion had finally begun to play tricks on me. Still, the thought wouldn't leave. I started watching him more closely, waiting for more signs. Sometimes, when I left the room quietly and came back suddenly, his head would be turned slightly. Not much, just a few inches. Once I swore I heard a soft sigh escape his lips. I told the nurse about it, but she smiled kindly and said, "It's just reflexes." It happens. I wanted to believe her. I needed to. Because the alternative, that he could move and simply didn't, was unthinkable. There were nights when the silence in the house became unbearable. I'd lie awake, listening to the faint hum of the oxygen machine and feel eyes on me, heavy, deliberate, awake. Once, I turned on the light suddenly and caught him staring straight at me. Not blankly, not lost, staring. Our eyes met for a fraction of a second before he slowly closed them again. My heart pounded so hard I thought I'd faint. I whispered his name. Nothing. I said it louder. Still, nothing. He was still as stone, as if the moment had never happened. I told myself it was a dream. It had to be. But after that night, everything I saw felt different. The room felt different. I began locking the door when I left, marking small things, a book on the shelf, a chair leg, the edge of the blanket, to see if they moved. Sometimes they did. Sometimes they didn't. Each day became a tug of war between love and fear, between faith and suspicion. I wanted to believe he was still my helpless boy, the son I'd devoted my life to caring for. But another part of me, the tired, haunted part, began to wonder if I was the one trapped. I told no one, not the nurse, not the doctor. Who would believe an old man saying his paralyzed son blinked on purpose? I kept it buried, convincing myself that love was stronger than doubt, that a father's heart must never suspect his child. But inside, I knew something was wrong. I could feel it in the way his silence began to change. It wasn't weak anymore. It was watching. The doctor came into our lives one winter morning, unannounced and uninterested in my history of faith. He was young, too young, I thought, with clear eyes and a voice that sounded like it trusted nothing but evidence. He took over the local clinic after the old physician retired. Everyone praised him for his modern ways, his machines, his science. To me, he was just another man who would tell me what I already knew, that my son would never walk again. But from the first time he examined my boy, I noticed something different. He didn't pity him. He didn't even look sad. He looked curious. He asked me questions no one had ever asked before. How often do you see involuntary muscle movement? Has his weight changed significantly in recent years? Do his eyes ever react to sudden sound? I hesitated each time, unsure what to say. I told him I'd seen twitches once or twice. He didn't smile or nod, just wrote something down and said, That sound chilled me more than any diagnosis. He wasn't convinced. He wasn't believing. After that first visit, He asked to review my son's old medical files. He spent hours going through them, muttering quietly under his breath. Finally, he looked up and said something that made my stomach twist. "The scans you have are very old. 2 decades old, correct?" I nodded. He leaned back in his chair. "Medicine has changed since then. Technology has changed. We should take a new MRI. It might tell us something different." For a moment, I didn't breathe. I had lived 25 years clinging to the idea that nothing could change. That was the foundation of my life, my reason to keep caring, keep believing. If the new scan showed nothing new, I'd lose nothing. But if it did, if it showed something I wasn't ready to see, I'd lose everything. "I don't think that's necessary," I said softly. The doctors back then were clear. "There's no cure." He looked at me, not unkindly, but firmly. "Mr. Hayes," he said, "sometimes people believe what comforts them, not what's true. Let's see what's true." That night, I couldn't sleep. His words echoed in my head. What's true? I walked into my son's room, stood by his bedside, and studied his face. 25 years, and he looked almost the same. Only his hair had turned gray at the temples. His body had thinned, but his skin was unmarked, too clean for someone who couldn't move. My hands began to tremble. I whispered, "We'll go for another test, my boy. Maybe something good will come of it." His eyes, open, dark, and calm, blinked once. Slow, controlled. Something inside me recoiled, but I said nothing. The next morning, I called the clinic and signed the papers. My hands shook as I wrote my name, as though each letter was undoing a piece of the life I'd built. The doctor scheduled the scan for Friday. "We'll pick him up in the ambulance," he said. "It'll be simple." His calmness scared me more than any alarm could. In the days leading up to it, I couldn't stop watching my son. I saw patterns where before I'd seen stillness. The way his eyes followed me across the room. The faint tightening in his jaw when I turned off the light. The way his hand rested just differently each morning, as though he'd adjusted it in the night. My heart wanted to dismiss it all, to keep believing in the version of him I had built for 25 years. But my mind, worn, tired, suspicious, began to wake up. On the morning of the scan, I dressed him carefully, buttoning his shirt, fixing his collar. My hands were steady, but my heart was not. "You'll be fine," I whispered, though I wasn't sure who I was talking to, him or myself. The ambulance came, the doctor waiting inside with his clipboard. He smiled politely, but there was a sharpness in his eyes. "We'll take good care of him," he said. I nodded, but as the doors closed and the siren began to wail softly, a strange fear crawled up my spine. The kind that comes not from losing faith, but from realizing faith might have been misplaced all along. The hospital smelled like bleach and silence, that sharp, clean quiet that always feels heavier than noise. I walked beside the stretcher as they wheeled my son down the corridor, his body perfectly still under the white sheet. The fluorescent lights passed above us in rhythm, one after another, like a slow heartbeat. I told myself this was just another test. We'd done so many over the years. Nothing ever changed. But somewhere deep inside, a small, trembling part of me hoped, and feared that hope itself was a sin. When we reached the MRI room, the doctor's tone changed. He became careful, measured. "You can stay outside the glass, Mr. Hayes," he said, gesturing to a small viewing window. I nodded and stepped back. The room beyond looked like something from another world. Silver machines, wires, screens that hummed softly. They slid my son onto the narrow table and fitted a brace around his head. He didn't blink, didn't flinch. His eyes stayed open, fixed on the ceiling. The machine began to hum, low at first, then louder. The sound filled the air like a distant storm. I pressed my palm against the glass, watching his reflection beside mine. For a moment, I remembered the little boy who used to ride on my shoulders, shouting at clouds. I whispered, "Hold on, son," though I knew he couldn't hear me. Then it happened. Subtle, quick, but unmistakable. His eyes moved, not randomly, deliberately. They flicked toward the door, then back to the ceiling. My heart stopped. I leaned closer. His fingers, those long, thin fingers I had cleaned and stretched for decades, tightened ever so slightly. Not from reflex, from will. I felt it in my bones. "Doctor," I said through the intercom, my voice shaking. His eyes moved. "Did you see that?" The doctor didn't answer immediately. He was staring at the monitor, his brow furrowed. His assistant leaned close, whispering something I couldn't hear. I pressed the button again. "Doctor, please." His eyes. He finally spoke, calm but clipped. "We see it, Mr. Hayes. Please wait." His tone wasn't surprised. It was controlled, too controlled. The machine's hum grew louder. The lights inside flickered in rhythm. My son's face was lit in soft pulses of white. I watched, frozen, as his eyes darted again, left, right, then straight toward me, directly into mine through the glass. For a heartbeat, I couldn't move. He was looking at me, not blankly, not lost, looking. And in that look, I saw something I hadn't seen in 25 years. Not pain, not helplessness, but awareness. And worse, calm awareness. I stumbled back from the glass, gripping the wall. My breath came short. "Doctor," I said again, weaker this time. "What's happening?" He didn't answer. He was typing something rapidly, his face tight with focus. The assistant turned briefly toward me, eyes wide, uncertain. I could tell she was seeing it too. The deliberate movements, the shifting eyes, the muscle flickers. It wasn't my imagination. Minutes passed like hours. When the machine finally stopped, the silence was deafening. The doctor pressed a button, and the table slid my son slowly out. His face was pale under the harsh light. The assistant removed the brace and stepped aside. "He can't be sedated," she whispered. He wasn't sedated. I didn't understand what she meant, but I could feel her fear. The doctor finally turned to me. His voice was quiet. Too quiet. "Mr. Hayes," he said, "please wait outside while we review the scan." I nodded numbly, though my legs barely carried me. As I stepped into the hall, I looked back through the glass one last time. My son's head was turned, not by them, but by himself, and his eyes were following me as I left the room. I walked to the waiting area like a man half awake. Every step felt heavier, my heart pounding so hard I could hear it over the hum of the hospital lights. For 25 years, I'd begged for a miracle. And now I wasn't sure if I'd just witnessed one, or something far worse. They called me into the doctor's office 3 hours later. I remember every detail, the hum of the ceiling fan, the stack of files on his desk, the faint smell of coffee going cold. The young doctor didn't look triumphant. He looked disturbed. His assistant stood beside him, pale, her arms folded like she was holding herself together. On the wall, the new MRI scans glowed faintly, white, gray, and shadow. I couldn't understand what I was seeing, but the doctor's face told me enough. Something was terribly wrong, not with the film, but with the truth I had believed for 25 years. He motioned for me to sit. I did. My hands wouldn't stop shaking. Then he spoke. Slow, careful, like he was trying to make sure I heard every word. "Mr. Hayes, your son's scans show no spinal damage, no neural blockage, no injury that could explain paralysis." I stared at him blankly. "That's impossible," I said. "He's been paralyzed since the accident." The old doctors said his nerves were dead. The doctor nodded softly. "I've reviewed those records. The initial diagnosis was made based on outdated imaging. The technology was primitive compared to now. But even then, there's something that doesn't add up. The spinal column was normal, even then." His words sank slowly, like stones dropping into deep water. "What are you saying?" I whispered. "Are you saying he could have moved?" The doctor hesitated, then said it. The sentence that destroyed everything I thought I knew. "There's no medical reason he can't move, Mr. Hayes. None. His body is fully functional. His muscles are weak from inactivity, yes, but his paralysis isn't real." I couldn't breathe. I looked at the glowing images on the wall, those gray ribbons and bright patches, and saw nothing but betrayal. "You mean to tell me," I stammered, "that my son has been pretending?" The doctor sighed. "I can't speak for his intentions, but from what we've observed, the paralysis is psychological, or voluntary." Voluntary. That word hit me harder than any blow ever could. My mouth went dry. My voice cracked. "He's been lying to me?" The doctor didn't answer. He just looked down, as if ashamed on my behalf. My hands clenched into fists on the desk. 25 years flashed before my eyes. Every morning I carried him, every meal I fed him, every sleepless night I spent begging God to ease his pain. Every time I cried alone, thinking I wasn't doing enough. And now, the truth stood in front of me, cruel and cold. I had given up my life for a lie. The doctor must have seen the color drain from my face because he reached across the desk. "Mr. Hayes, please," he said gently. "Whatever the reason, you mustn't react in anger." If this was conscious deceit, it likely began as something else: dependency, fear, emotional trauma. We can arrange psychological evaluation. There might be... I stood up so fast the chair fell backward. "Stop," I said, my voice low but shaking. "Don't try to make it sound merciful. You're telling me my son could have stood up at any time, could have walked, could have lived, and he didn't." The doctor said nothing. There was nothing left to say. I stumbled out of that room like a drunk man, the hallway tilting around me. My heart was beating so loud I could hear it echoing. I passed nurses who smiled politely, unaware that my world had just turned to ash. Outside the ward, I sat on a bench and buried my face in my hands. The world I'd built on love and faith had collapsed in a single sentence. I had spent 25 years living for someone who had been lying in front of me, watching me give everything, pretending to be broken. When the doctor finally came out, he handed me the MRI film in an envelope. "Take this home," he said softly. "You'll need to talk to him." I didn't answer. I just stared at that thin paper, that fragile proof of my blindness. The air felt heavy, poisonous. I walked out of the hospital with the envelope under my arm, but it felt like I was carrying a coffin. Not his, but mine. The ride home felt endless. The envelope sat on my lap like a living thing, its edges damp from my trembling hands. Every bump in the road made my chest ache. The driver spoke once, asked if I was all right, but I couldn't answer. What words could explain 25 years of devotion turned into humiliation? By the time I reached the house, evening light had begun to fade, and the shadows stretched long across the porch where I used to sit with him, believing silence meant peace. Now it felt like that silence had been laughter. Quiet, cruel laughter I'd never heard. I opened the door. The air inside smelled of disinfectant and memory. My son was in his chair, just as I'd left him. The same blanket, the same stillness, the same face that once looked like innocence. I set the envelope on the table beside him. "They gave me your results," I said, my voice dry. He didn't blink. "They say you're fine, that there's nothing wrong with you." I waited. Still nothing. I leaned closer. "Do you hear me?" That's when it happened. The smallest, most devastating thing I'd ever seen. His lips twitched, not from accident, from control. A faint, deliberate curl, the ghost of a smirk. My breath caught. "You knew," I whispered. "All these years." He said nothing, just looked at me with calm, steady eyes. Not the eyes of a victim, the eyes of someone who had been watching. I stumbled backward, nearly tripping over the chair. "Why?" I asked, my voice cracking. "Why would you do this?" His gaze followed me, slow and deliberate. It wasn't guilt I saw there. It was ownership. As if my pain belonged to him. As if every year I spent feeding him, cleaning him, praying over him, was part of some game only he understood. I wanted to believe I was wrong. That maybe the doctor had made a mistake. That maybe this was still some misunderstood miracle of science. But I'd seen the truth in that MRI room. I'd seen his eyes move when he thought I wasn't supposed to see. And now, face to face, there was no denying it. I dropped to my knees in front of him, shaking. "You could have lived," I whispered. "You could have walked. You could have had a life." My words echoed through the house like confession. "I gave you everything. I gave you me." He blinked once, slow, unbothered. My tears blurred his face. I wanted him to speak, to explain, to cry, to do something human. But he didn't. He just stared. And in that stillness, I realized what I had been feeding all these years wasn't love. It was his control. All those nights I thought he was praying silently. He was listening, watching, measuring how far he could push my devotion before it broke. He had never needed my help. He had chosen it. Chosen to let me believe he was helpless so that I would never leave. Maybe it started small, fear of abandonment, dependence. But somewhere along the way, it became cruelty. I saw it now, in the small ways I had ignored. The faint movements I'd excused, the slight changes I'd explained away, the pity I'd mistaken for purpose. I walked to the window, unable to look at him anymore. My reflection in the glass looked older, smaller, hollow. "You stole my life," I said quietly, "and you didn't even have to move to do it." The only sound was the ticking of the clock, the same one that had counted every wasted year. I looked back at him one last time. His head was tilted slightly, his eyes still locked on me, not pleading, not sorry, just calm. He wasn't afraid of me. He never had been. He knew I wouldn't hurt him. He knew I couldn't. The envelope with the MRI lay open on the table, the film catching the weak light. I picked it up, staring at the proof. Those lines and shadows that showed nothing broken except me. Then I set it back down. I didn't need a doctor's explanation anymore. The truth wasn't in the scan. It was sitting right in front of me, staring with eyes that had never been paralyzed, only merciless. I don't remember standing up. One moment I was staring at the window, the next I was pacing the room, my hands trembling like old wires about to snap. 25 years of spoonfuls, bedpans, canceled birthdays, sleepless nights. All of it replayed inside my head like a cruel film I couldn't turn off. Each memory now burned instead of comforted. I saw myself lifting him out of bed on my aching back. I saw myself selling my wedding ring to buy his medicine. I saw myself weeping quietly into a towel so he wouldn't see my tears. And in every scene, he sat there, silent, still, watching me give him my life like it was owed to him. My chest ached so hard I thought I might collapse. I sat on the edge of his bed, the same spot where I'd whispered prayers for his healing, and felt the fabric under my hands. "Why?" I whispered again, softer this time. "Why did you do this to me?" He blinked slowly, deliberately. No words, no tears, just the calm stare of someone who knows your soul and has no intention of explaining. That stare shattered something inside me that had survived everything else. For the first time in 25 years, I saw my son not as a victim, but as an oppressor. My devotion had been his shelter. My faith had been his weapon. He had taken my belief, the strongest part of me, and turned it into a chain. And I had worn it willingly. That realization was not like a thunderclap. It was like a slow, crushing weight on my chest, pressing until I could hardly breathe. I stood and walked to the corner of the room where I kept his supplies. Bottles, gloves, folded blankets. I touched each one like it was a gravestone. Each represented a piece of my life given away. I felt my fingers curl around the edge of the cabinet to steady myself. My body wasn't shaking from weakness anymore. It was shaking from a rage I had never allowed myself to feel. Not the kind that makes you strike out, but the kind that makes you see the world with terrifying clarity. In that moment, every comforting lie I'd told myself fell away. Love does not mean losing yourself. Faith does not mean blind obedience. Sacrifice without truth is just self-destruction. I had mistaken all three for virtues, and my son had used that mistake as a fortress. My throat burned with words I couldn't speak. I wanted to scream. I wanted to demand an explanation. I wanted to hear him say anything, even a lie, just to break the silence. But he stayed quiet, as if my suffering was his final performance. I walked over to him, stood so close I could see the flecks of color in his eyes. "You can stop now," I said, my voice low and steady. "I know the truth." For a fraction of a second, I saw something flicker in his gaze. Not fear, not guilt, but recognition. Then it vanished. That flicker was all I needed. He knew I knew. And he didn't care. I turned away before my knees gave out. In the kitchen, I leaned against the counter, staring at the worn tiles. 25 years of devotion, of feeding a lie, had hollowed me out until there was nothing left to burn but the truth. My hands gripped the edge of the counter so hard my knuckles whitened. For the first time, I wasn't thinking about his needs. I was thinking about mine, about what life I had left, about the years I could never get back. That night, I didn't prepare his dinner. I didn't change his sheets. I didn't sit by his bed and pray. I sat alone in the dark, my face in my hands, and let the silence wrap around me. Not his silence, but mine. It wasn't surrender. It was the beginning of something else. Not anger, not revenge, just release. I knew then that I could not continue as before, that the father he had known, the servant he had built his life on, was gone. I didn't sleep that night. I sat in my chair until dawn, the light from the window turning the room from black to gray and gray to gold. It was the first sunrise I had watched for myself in 25 years. Every other morning I had woken for him, to lift, to feed, to clean, to pray. But that morning, I didn't move. I just watched the light crawl across the floor, touching the empty bowls, the medicine bottles, the folded blankets. The world was waking, and for the first time, I felt no duty to follow. When I finally stood, my legs felt weak but free. I walked into his room quietly. He was awake. Of course he was. His eyes followed me as I moved. I didn't speak. I opened the windows, letting the air in, the curtains flapping like wings. The house smelled different in the morning light, cleaner, colder, like a place preparing to be empty. I turned to him, my son, the man I had carried longer than I should have. For a moment, I just looked. I searched his face for something human, regret, shame, sorrow, anything. But there was nothing. Just the same calm, calculating stillness. "I'm leaving," I said finally. The words sounded strange, like they belonged to someone else. "You can walk. So walk your own life now." His eyes blinked once, slow, measured. Not surprise, not confusion, just acknowledgement. Like he had been waiting to hear those words for years. That was when I realized something terrible. Maybe this had always been his plan. Maybe keeping me trapped in devotion was never about weakness. It was about control. And now that I had broken free, he didn't even try to stop me. I went to the drawer beside his bed and took out a small notepad. I tore a single page, the paper shaking in my hand. I wrote 4 words. "You can walk now." I folded it neatly and placed it on his blanket, next to his hand. Then I reached for the keys on the table, the same ones I had used to lock and unlock our world for 25 years. I stared at them for a long time before setting them down. "You don't need me anymore," I said quietly. "Maybe you never did." He blinked again, slow and deliberate, his gaze unbroken. I felt something twist inside me, a mix of anger, heartbreak, and strange relief. I waited for him to react, to show any sign that he cared I was leaving. He didn't. That silence, that unbearable silence, became the final answer to every question I'd ever asked. I walked to the doorway and paused, looking back one last time. The room looked smaller than it ever had, like it couldn't contain what had just happened. For 25 years, it had been the center of my world. Now it was just a room with walls, furniture, and a man who could move, but chose not to. I thought about saying goodbye, but the word didn't fit anymore. Goodbye belongs to people who share love. What we had left wasn't love. It was an echo. I stepped outside into the cold morning air. The sky was pale and empty. My steps felt unsteady at first, but lighter with each one. The road ahead looked endless, but at least it was mine. Behind me, the house stood silent. I didn't look back again. By the time I reached the edge of the street, I felt the weight begin to lift, the invisible chain that had bound me breaking link by link. My hands still shook, my eyes still burned, but my spine felt straighter than it had in decades. Freedom hurts at first. It cuts where devotion used to hold you. But once the bleeding stops, it feels like breathing again. That morning, I didn't feel like a saint or a victim. I felt like a man who had finally remembered himself. I didn't know where I was going, only that it would be far. Somewhere I could live without the shadow of that chair, that bed, that silence. I left everything behind, the keys, the notes, the guilt. And as the door closed behind me, it sounded less like an ending and more like a sentence finally completed. I live alone now. A small cottage by the edge of a quiet river, far from the house that once defined my life. The world here moves differently, slower, softer, without the weight of routine. Some mornings, I still wake before dawn out of habit, expecting to hear the hum of his oxygen machine, the creak of the wheelchair, the small sounds of a house built around someone else's silence. But then I open my eyes and remember. That sound, that life, that burden is gone. What remains is just me, an old man learning how to exist for himself again. People in the village know me simply as Mr. Hayes. They don't know the story. They just see an old man who buys bread, feeds the birds, and takes long walks by the river. I like it that way. I don't want sympathy. I've had enough of pity to last a lifetime. I've learned that pity, when misplaced, can ruin both the giver and the receiver. It turns kindness into a cage. It turned me into a servant of my own love. Sometimes at night, I sit by the lamp with a cup of tea and the MRI film the doctor gave me, the one I swore I'd thrown away. I keep it folded in a drawer. I don't look at it often, but when I do, it feels like staring at a ghost. Those gray lines and empty spaces aren't just scans of a spine. They're a map of my 25 years of blindness, a record of how devotion, when unexamined, can become self-destruction. Every time I see that image, I hear the doctor's voice again. There's no injury, no paralysis, no reason he can't move. It took me years to accept that sentence wasn't just about my son's body. It was about mine too. I was the one paralyzed by love, by guilt, by duty, by faith that refused to question itself. I called it loyalty, but it was fear. Fear of being a bad father, fear of breaking a promise, fear of seeing truth instead of illusion. When I finally walked out that door, I realized I wasn't abandoning my son. I was freeing myself from a lie I had helped build. Sometimes I wonder if he ever stood up after I left, if he ever tried, if he sat there in that same chair, waiting for another victim to feed him with affection and sorrow. I'll never know. And that's how it must stay. Some truths, once seen, must be left behind. Going back to face them again would only reopen the wound. You can forgive life for its cruelty, but you can't unsee deceit, especially when it wears the face of your child. I think of my wife often. I imagine what she'd say if she knew. Maybe she already knew, somewhere beyond this world. Maybe that's why she died sooner, because she saw the truth before I did. I wish I could ask her if she'd forgive me for wasting half a lifetime believing in something false. But I think she would, because she always said love is never wasted, even when given to the wrong person. It still proves your heart was true. So I try not to hate my son. Hatred would mean I still carry him with me. Instead, I've let him fade, like a photograph left too long in the sun. There's no anger now, only understanding. Understanding that people can hide their darkness so well that even love can't find it. Understanding that sometimes the greatest act of faith is to stop believing in lies. When people ask me if I have children, I pause. I smile faintly and say, once. It's easier that way. Then I return to my small table, my quiet river, my simple life. Some days, the peace feels heavy, like something I haven't earned. Other days, it feels like the miracle I had prayed for all along. Not his healing, but mine. Final thought. I cared for my paralyzed son for 25 years, believing I was keeping him alive. But when the doctor showed me that MRI, I realized the truth. He'd never been broken. I had. The scan didn't reveal his body. It revealed my 25 years of blindness.